Good morning. Welcome, thank you for coming. I'm John Seddon, in case you hadn't guessed. Peter Day, the veteran BBC journalist, was interviewing Marvin Bower. Now, Marvin Bower is the man who built McKinsey into the massive organisation that it is today. And Marvin Bower was retiring at the time of this interview. And Day asked Bower, given we're now in the 21st century, what's your greatest regret about management? And Bower's answer was the prevalence of command and control. Peter Day put the same question to Peter Drucker. If you don't know Peter Drucker, he's one of the most important management thinkers of the last century. And Drucker said, yes, I agree with my friend Marvin Bower. The greatest problem is the prevalence of command and control. When I ask people, what's the problem with command and control? They tend to focus on the command word. Bosses are too bossy. We need to be coaches. We need to be servant leaders. The lean people think it's all about respect for people. Leaders should be coaches and all that malarkey. Well, I disagree completely. I know there are times when leaders need to be bossy, especially during the change that we're going to describe to you today. The problem is not the command word. The problem is the control word. What's wrong with command and control is that we control our organisations in ways which massively sub-optimise performance, big style. And you'll see this today. And here's the irony. The backbone of our controls in organisations is the budget. I'm sure you all love spending time on budgets, eh? And here's the thing. Here's the bit of trivia you can do when you're having dinner. Who invented budget management? A certain James McKinsey. 100 years ago, working with Alfred Sloan ran General Motors. General Motors was an amorphous mass. They needed to create some form of order to see what was working, what was not working. And to create that form of order, McKinsey invented budget management. It's only 100 years old. But now it is, well, it proliferates. It's the norm. Everybody does it. And we shouldn't, because it makes performance worse. So we'll come back to budget management a bit later. My job is to talk about how we got here. Sort of a short history of my life, really. See, my first job, my first proper job anyway, my first job was really a lorry driver. But my first proper job, when I realised I was not going to make my fortune driving lorries, was as a prison psychologist. And I was employed in prisons doing one-to-ones with prisoners in the hope that if I had good counselling skills that I could help them become better people. And I met this fellow called Nick Georgiades, and he said to me, John, instead of working with individuals, why don't you work on the system? Because you'll have a much greater impact. And it's one of those moments when you think, I know he's right, but I don't know what he means, and I don't know what I'd do. But boy, that sounds better than what I'm doing at the moment. So he was the head of faculty, Department of Occupational Psychology in London University. So I gave up my clinical studies, and I went to study under Nick in occupational psychology. And I was completely fascinated by a subject called intervention theory and method. Really loved it. And basically, intervention theory and method is all about how you as an interventionist can go into an organisation and help people change things constructively in such a way that subsequently they can change things like that without your help. And this is still today a fundamental principle in the way in which Vanguard works. And that's unusual. You see, if I was a senior consultant in one of the big consultancies, my job would be to ensure the leaders don't think without me in the room. They encourage dependency. And we're committed to independent thinking and action. So there I was. I did very well in my master's degree and came out into the world, as it were, fascinated by this subject, but kind of realizing that I had no meat in my sandwich, you know. So I knew a lot about intervention theory, and it was my first love, but what am I going to intervene on? And then I got lucky. I got lucky in a couple of ways. The first thing that happened that was a bit lucky for me was I met a man called Peter Edwards. So this is about 1985, I think, something like that. And Peter was the director of a little division in Honeywell Bull, computer company, which existed at the time, French-owned. And only had about 80 people in it. It was called distribution. And what did distribution do? Well, basically, they took orders from salespeople for stuff that customers wanted and got the stuff to customers. That's basically all they did. And I was introduced to Peter, and he said to me when I met him, "Well, John, the problem I've got is that my top team don't work properly together when I'm not here." And being a good psychologist, I said, "Well, that's probably got something to do with you then." And he said, no, there's nothing wrong with me, I'm fine. And being a principled kind of person, I started packing my bag and I got up to leave. Before I got to the door, Peter had come around his desk, he put his arm around me and said, no, stay here, John, it's okay, don't go away. Why don't you go out into the organisation for as long as you need to, have a look at what's going on, I'll pay you for this. And I'm thinking, oh, good, you know. Come back and talk to me. So I did that. And what I found when I went out there is that the people in the front line were miserable. And the problem that they had is so many of the orders that came through from salespeople, they could not fulfill because of lack of stock or competition between salespeople for stock or interference from the salespeople or interference from the managers. A whole host of reasons. And so, of course, people shouted at them a lot. You know. Anyway, so I went back to see Peter. I said, well, this is the problem. We decided to go off-site with all the managers for a couple of days. We went to the Berestede Hotel in Ascot. We did some work on getting sort of verbatim views from the sales force, their customers, on what they're like. You know, the distribution division won the wooden spoon at every annual conference. You know, it was the armpit of the business kind of thing. And so we spent 2 days discussing this and doing some exercise and thinking about things. And we came to the conclusion on the Friday afternoon that what we need to do is for the managers to spend their time with the people in the front line, and the purpose is to give them the wherewithal to solve all the problems. You know? And being a young man who needed consultancy work, I said to Peter on the Friday afternoon as we were saying goodbye, well, you know, I expect you need some help from me. And he said, no, we know what to do. Thank you very much. You kind of go home thinking, oh. 3 months later, he sent me a videotape. And the people that I saw, this tape is actually on our e-learning system on the web, as you can watch it. The people in the front line that I've met who were miserable were buzzing. Distribution had gone from the wooden spoon part of the company to the bit of the company everybody loved. So I was so impressed. I mean, I was massively moved to see this. So I called Peter. I said, okay, so I know what you did. Yeah, he said, let me tell you how I started. He said, on the Monday when we got in, after the thing in the Berestede, I got in really early and I locked all the managers' doors to their offices. And I waited till they'd all come in and got a bit confused and mingled around. And I went out to them and said, look, you know, what did we agree on Friday? You can't do it in your offices. That's where we're going to spend our time. And it reminded me of something I learned from intervention theory, that sometimes the physical interventions are the most profound. Okay? So I learnt that here's the thing, that if we can design a service organisation where the people at the front end of the organisation have the wherewithal to do what matters to the customers, the service is amazing. Of course, that's counterintuitive to a command and control thinker, isn't it? Because they think if you give customers more, well, if you give customers what they need, it will cost you more. That's what they think. And they're wrong. So Peter got promoted. So everyone thought he was a clever boy, and so he got promoted. Now he's running a 1,000-person organisation fixing computers, engineers fixing computers, 1,000 of them. And he called me up and said, why don't we do that again then? And so this time he and I went out and looked around the business, and what we saw is that the managers, they were preoccupied with things like how many jobs the people were doing and how long the jobs took and how much material they were using, how much material cost, and you know, did they get their car serviced at the right time and how much petrol were they using and all of that. And when you look at their activity, you think, do you know what, they're not even focused. They're not at all focused on their customers. So Peter and I dreamed up a wheeze. What we're going to do, he says, we're going to send all the managers, he got them in a room, he said, we're going to send you all out to visit your customers. And you're going to ask them 2 questions. You're going to say, how do you rate the service we provide out of 10? And anybody who rates it less than 9, because after all we're British, you know, no one gets 10. If anyone who rates it less than 9, you ask a second question, what have we got to do to make it 10? And when you've understood that and clarified it, and show them that you've understood it, then you're going to go and do it. Simple. Now the board heard about this in Honeywell Bull, and the board took the view, this ain't cricket, this is cheating, they said. You know, if you want to know about your customers, you should hire professional people who know how to do surveys amongst customers. And Peter and I are thinking, you see, this simple little structure helps you understand what actually matters to your customers. In a sense, the customers write the items. You know, instead of managers writing the items. Who should write the items for a customer survey? So that's what we did. And Peter was out amongst them all the time. In 1 year, that part of the organisation went from the bottom to the top of the Data Pro survey. The customers went from pretty miserable to absolutely amazed. Revenue grew, more customers came on board. Ka-ching. So we learned another simple principle. You need to understand what matters to your customers. So two basic things. Design the front end so they got the expertise and the wherewithal to give customers what they need. And then find out what matters to the customers. See, this stuff's easy, isn't it? And you know, these are still basic principles for how we work. And then I got lucky in a separate way. I was asked, because we'd just done these things, Peter and I, and Honeywell Bull had also, in parallel, spent millions on a total quality management program. Some of you will be old enough to remember these. This was like Lean or Six Sigma, but it was in the 1980s. You know, the idea to an interventionist is basically that you train people in some tools and techniques and you send them out to solve problems that you think you've got. And it didn't work. So I learned a lot. You know, I learned you can't change a system with the toolbox. I learned a lot of the theories implicit in the tools, the diametrically opposed to the theory of the firm. I learnt subsequently, of course, that the manager's view of their problems was not their real problems. It's their mindset, their command and control mindset defines the wrong kind of problems, and so on. But to do this work, I had to read all the quality gurus, and I became completely fascinated with the work of W. Edwards Deming. If you haven't read his book, Out of the Crisis, you should read it. It's a scathing critique of Western management thought. He makes the simple point that we, mankind, invented management, so we can reinvent it. Current management doesn't work at all, so let's change it. And we need to understand and manage our organizations as systems. So like, I had the first kind of pieces, get the right expertise at the front end, understand what matters to your customers. So how do you build a system that always does that? And so then I got lucky with Peter because he left Honeywell Bull and we worked in a series of small telecommunications organizations that were losing money and turned them around. And he valued the idea that we start with studying, which is now a focus of the Vanguard Method. And then because study gets you knowledge, you can predict what's going to happen when you make a change. We would argue a bit about whether we knew enough. I was kind of go, we need to know more to really know what's going to happen when we do this. And Peter would argue, oh, well, let's do it, because we're still studying. So I kind of learned how fast you can go with a leader like that. I mean, the first one, Talkland, for example, was losing £1 million a month. And we got it to break even in 6 months, and then we set industry standards for operating performance. It was just good fun. And it was through that period of about 12 years working together that we really developed what became the Vanguard Method. And today we're in 11 countries. In every country we start in, we grow. Why? Because of the results. For example, I mean, there are some people here from Aviva, okay? Aviva regard the Vanguard Method as a strategic signature. They're one of many companies who have taken it on wholesale, okay? It's a strategic signature. What's the first job? We haven't been involved with them now for 5 or 6 years, or maybe longer. But one of the first things we did a long time ago is we helped them with the repatriation of calls from India. Okay, when we started with them, they had 200 people doing calls in the UK, 500 people in India, 700 altogether, calls serving customers. And when we finished, and the service was pretty dire, when we finished, they had 300 people in the UK handling all customer demand, and the service was amazing. That's quite impressive, isn't it? We do a lot of work in repairs organisations, whether repairing computers or houses or central heating systems, anything. Barry will be talking about break-fix systems later. Do you know, we can help repairs organisations deliver repairs to customers on the day and at the time they want the repair done. None of this waiting all morning, waiting all afternoon. These organisations turn up on the day and the hour that you want and fix it. And they operate at about half the cost of what it was before they started. These are big results. And if you take one of our passions is people-centered services. So there are a lot of people here who deal with what we call people-centered services. This is helping people whose lives have fallen off the rails. And if you listen to the rhetoric in Whitehall, you know, the narrative, as they call it, is that people are getting older, demand is rising, so who's going to pay? Well, those organisations that have applied the Vanguard Method understand that that is false. The true narrative is that people are getting older, but demand is stable. What's growing massively is failure demand because the services that we pay for are ineffective, and half of the money, at least, that we spend on services for people whose lives have fallen off the rails is wasted. So when we actually design a service that's effective, it's the same story, better service, much, much lower costs. Of course, the question is how, isn't it? And this is where intervention theory comes in. It's so important, you see. One of the things I learned about intervention theory is a distinction between rational interventions and normative interventions. Okay, so I'll give you an example. You know, rational is like what's going on now. I taught you listen. So I taught you listen, and what you do is you map what I say onto your mental model, because that's what human beings do. So, for example, I might say to you, there's a bit of a problem with targets. And your mental model might go, yeah, because sometimes, it's about how do you set the right target, or how do you get the right people involved in setting the target, how do you get ownership of targets, you might go there kind of thing. And then I would say, well, no, my problem is that targets make performance worse. And then your mind would go, John, really? Really? See, I've offended your rational position, your mental model. However, if I take you into your organization and help you study, you will learn that any arbitrary measure driven down a hierarchy suboptimizes performance. You'll see it. You won't be able to deny it. That's a normative change. You will change your mental model. And once you've seen it and you can't deny it, you can't go back. You can't be judicious about doing the wrong thing. You'll become passionate about not doing the wrong thing, and your mind is open to doing the right thing. Because I need to introduce you to better methods of control. Because you've just discovered that one of your primary controls is not controlling anything, it's sending the system out of control. That's normative change. Okay, so this is, if you like, the hard part about this. This isn't, you decide what problems you've got and you employ some tools that Vanguard have developed to go and solve it. This is you go out and study and you realise the problems you've got, you think you've got, are not the problems you've really got, but you've studied them in such a way that you can get massive leverage. And at the same time, you change the way you think. So it was about the same time, mid-late 80s, that I met a man called Mike Swalwell, who was working in Digital Equipment Corporation. Doesn't exist anymore, digital. But they did something quite radical. This is about 86, I think. They started selling computers over the phone. Now, in 1986, that was unusual. And Mike wanted to maximize sales, quite right. And he was seeking advice from me and another fella on what do we do to maximize sales. Now, the other fella, he said, well, the way to maximize sales, increase your sales, Mike, is incentivize the front line. Anything over 100 quid, give them a fiver, that kind of thinking. And I said, no. See, I'm a psychologist, and I'll come back to this when I talk about HR. One of the things psychologists know that managers ought to know, and HR people certainly ought to know, is that whenever you incentivize behavior, you get less of what you want. So I said, well, no, we shouldn't do that. So Mike said, well, if we shouldn't do that, what should we do then, John? And I said, I don't know. Do you mind if I go and have a look? He said, yeah, go and have a look. And I just sat and listened to calls. These are people coming in buying computers. And we had all these calls that at that time I labelled calls we don't want. You haven't sent a bit, that bit doesn't fit with this bit, I don't know how to do that, can't turn this on, but whatever. And I said to Mike, do you know what, Mike, if we could design the service so we give them exactly what they need, we won't get these calls, we'd open up, therefore, our capacity, and we'll sell more stuff. So that's what we did. I called it demand we don't want. You recognise it, don't you? It's failure demand. It took us 9 years to come to a definition of failure demand. You're all familiar with this phrase, failure demand, aren't you? Yeah, it's the one that's got legs. It's the most easily understood concept, but it's also the most easily misunderstood concept. Any command and control thinker, mindset can understand it and go, oh, look at the cost. But that's when we first kind of discovered it. And then we saw the same thing again in a bank. So it was about 1987, 88, along came automated call distribution systems. And so the people running the bank said, oh, this is great. What we're going to do is we'll take people out of the branches proportionate to the telephone work. They cost us £16,000 a year, so we'll get rid of them. And we'll go and hire people at £8,000 a year and put them in a call centre in the armpit of Britain. So we'll go to Scunthorpe, Swansea, Glasgow. That's what was happening. There were consultants with maps of where you can buy cheap people. Totally amazing. And so that's what they did. So this bank we were working with, they sent out the guys in the white coats who measured how many calls, how long they take. So they planned for 3 call centres, 1,000 seats in each. They did the training, put the computer systems together, all the phone, all that stuff, turned the switches, and boom, demand went up. And because the way they think is this is all about how much work is coming in, how many people have I got, and how long do they have to do stuff. If the demand goes up, what do? Well, they opened a 4th. Demand went up, they opened a 5th. Now, the chief executive gets exercised about the fact that it's costing more now than it was to have expensive people in the branches. And the guys running the call centres, and they were men, it's usually men, they're going, well, it's like the M25 boss, you know, when it opened, it just filled up. And it's like that with our call centres. You see, it must be that the customers love us and they keep ringing us up. And it took us no time at all to establish that about half of the demand coming in was failure demand caused by a failure to do something right for a customer. It's a fundamental error to think you can just take a piece of telephone work out of something that's going on in a service and have it done somewhere else. But they were led down that path, of course, by the big consultancies. And you see, what's going on here is that they think it's important to control transaction costs. Remember this, so this comes down from the budget. And they're wrong. You know, one of the phrases I often use is if you get out to manage costs, your costs will go up. You will learn today that if you manage value, your costs will go down. Massively so. Today then, you know, everywhere we go around the world, service organisations have been designed as like industrial things. You know, we have front offices, call centres, that kind of thing. You know, where we worry about how much work coming in, how many people, how long they take. So we measure their activity, how many calls do you do, how long do you take on a call. We tell them, these are the controls I'm talking about now, okay? We tell them that we're going to make the things they must do in the call. And we might tell them they've got to follow scripts or protocols. We tell them that these things are going to be inspected. We might specialise the work because that will reduce our training costs. That also means we can introduce an IVR, press 1 for this and 2 for that. You know, these days a robot. This is all about trying to lower transaction costs. And then we have back offices. Do you know, when I was a boy, nobody used the phrase back office. But it was invented by an American. Most bad management ideas come across the pond. This is a guy called Chase, and he said, you know, here we are running our call centres, and we've got a bit of a dilemma because, you know, our job is to pick up calls within the service levels, and when we finish dealing with the customer, we might have to do some paperwork. They call that wrap time in call centre world. And now you've got the dilemma of what do you do? Do you finish this job and so your phone is off, or do you take the next call? He said, well, we can solve this problem by having a back office. So we use the front office to find out what they want. Decouple was the phrase he used. Decouple the customer from the service, send it to the back office. Now we can sweat the labour. And in the back office, the work is specialised. It's standardised. We give them standard times. We measure their activity. And, of course, we inspect them. I bet you've seen organisations like this, haven't you? You know, if you've got an organisation like this, you'll see high levels of failure demand. Guaranteed. Guaranteed. So, you know, when you explain this to managers, this concept of failure demand, they kind of go, yeah, and they go, their mental model goes, it's the people. If those people would do as they should. Or they go, it's the processes. Fix the processes. And you see, it isn't either of those things. It's the system. Failure demand is a systemic phenomenon. If you've got an organisation designed like that, you'll have a load of failure demand. There are now, I mean, this is unbelievable. Well, it's not really unbelievable. It's kind of what happens when numpties get hold of a profound idea. You know, there are people selling you software products so you can measure failure demand. Completely bonkers. Failure demand is no more than a signal that your system is badly designed and therefore your service is ineffective. If you buy a software product, all you're going to do is count it up and send it off to people and shout at them. But that's what command and control thinkers do, isn't it? Stupid. Completely stupid. I was in one situation where some people were telling me they were in financial services and they'd gone out and studied the front end and they had something like 45% failure demand, and they walked into their top bosses' offices and they said, bosses, you know, we've got about 40% whatever failure demand at the front end of our organisation. And one of the bosses actually said, yeah, well, that's probably normal in our sector. Wow, who needs leaders like that? But they're out there. Shocking, isn't it? So, how do you make a change? Well, you study. So if you've got a front office, back office kind of architecture, as most people have, the leaders have to go out and study. Right? It's no good me studying. I know what's going on. And if I communicated it to them, they'd object to what I'm saying. So that's rational, okay? Normative, I take the leaders, I say, okay, here we go. We're going to take a customer demand, what we call a value demand, like I want to buy a product, I want a service from you. And your job is to follow that demand all the way through your system, through the front office, through the back office. You know, it might go from the front office to 9 different bits of the back office because all the work's specialised. Go find out all that, how it comes back together. And when it goes out, and there's only one thing I want you to worry about, and that is when it goes back to the customer, is it perfectly clean? In other words, there is no reason why this customer should call again or make a further demand. That's the brief. And so they go and do one. And they come back into the room. It's always happens. They come back into the room and they go, okay, was it clean? Well, no. But that was unusual, John. Okay, take another. Take another. Take another. And they get it eventually. Nothing comes out clean. You see, their mental model is that if the people in the front end send it to the right places, and in those places the right people are there with the wherewithal, and they do it within the standard times and return it in the service level agreements, then it'll all work. And you know what? It never happens. Or very rarely. Now I've got them in the place where they need to be. The system's ineffective. You know, this is what they did in Aviva, for example. You know, when they're repatriating calls from India, there's something like 70% failure demand on the front end. You know, and don't think that's bad. You know, think, oh, great, they know. At least they know. Exacerbated by the fact we've done a lot of work repatriating calls from overseas that have been outsourced. You know, it was a fashion to outsource. Why? Lower transaction costs. But, you know, there's a real problem because what happens when you outsource, particularly to India, is they want a detailed specification of what it is they're to do. And then they'll only do what's in the specification. So then there's arguments about, do we do this or should we send it back? You see an awful lot of work being sent back. Or they do their bit and send it back for another bit. And then you get progress chasers. These are people that you pay for that aren't doing anything useful in terms of serving a customer. They're trying to progress chase and solve problems that are going on, you know, between the outsource and so on. But the important thing is that once you've understood what's going on, you can change it. So how do you design an effective service? This goes back to where we started. The first thing you've got to understand is the nature of demand in customer terms. It's the big lever in any transactional service. All my life, when I've talked to managers about this, well, you need to come and understand demand in customer terms, and they go, there could be all kind of... it wouldn't be predictable, John, demand. And do you know what? It always is. Always is. I mean, we were, not always actually, we were working for a police force and they got one call on Christmas Day and this person said, how many eggs in a lemon meringue pie? Well, don't worry about designing for that. Design for all the other stuff, why people ring the cops, because that's predictable. Okay, so that's the first thing that you need to know. And this is the first and most important of your organisational controls. Do you understand demand and its predictability in customer terms? Because if you do, then you can build the expertise that you need at that point where you transact with the customer to give the customers what they need. This is what they did in Aviva. This is what we do in any transactional service. Because that then gives you a focus on your second control, which is how do we get to do only the value work? Deliver the thing the customer needs. So obviously, you don't want to standardize what happens there, do you? Because customers aren't standard, are they? You know, what you learn when you study demand is that customers have variety in their demand, so you want to build the expertise that will absorb that variety. And to know how we're doing, we've got to measure achievement of purpose in customer terms. And that's your third control. So we've got three primary controls. Understanding demand, focus on the value work, measure achievement of purpose in customer terms. These are what we call leading measures. Now, when you do that, and those are your controls, what do you suppose happens to your cost as you improve against those measures? Have a guess. Yes, it goes. Come on. That's where you're supposed to talk to me. It goes down. That's a funny old thing, isn't it? Goes down. Manage value, costs go down. That's how Aviva got to 300. But let me also reflect on, prior to us doing this work with them and helping them do this work, of course, they had a plan. Because like all conventional management thinkers, managers think you can't make a change without a plan. And we said, put the plan away. You see, who would have put in a plan that we're going to go to 300? Be laughed out, wouldn't they? Okay? So here's another spooky thing. That when you study and you get knowledge, you know that you're going to improve, but you don't know by how much. So, you can take a view at the end of the study phase about the direction that you're going in, and that's as much as you can say. So this is unusual, isn't it? So in my life, I found myself in front of boards of managers, and they kind of go, oh, well, well, John, would you present your plan? And I'll go, well, no, there is no plan. The plan, if you like, is I'm going to take you out and show you how to study this place as a system so you get some knowledge, so you can change the way you think, so you can redesign it. And they go, no, we can't get this signed off without having a cost-benefit analysis and the projects and the deliverables and the milestones. I said, well, go find someone else then. I'm not doing that. Yeah, but you just did this for this other company, and we've seen their results, so why don't you write that? Well, because I don't know what you're going to do, frankly. You don't do this. And by the way, you might get as much as them, you might get more, you might get less. I don't know. Well, we need a plan. Well, you're not going to get one from me. Barry will be talking about repair services. But let me just show you how these controls work in people-centered services. I think I said earlier, of all the work we do, I consider it some of the most important work that we do. We're doing it across 11 countries. Because, funny thing is people's lives fall off the rails all over the world. Equally strange, the way in which we deal with them is pretty much the same all over the world, and it's not very effective. If your life fell off the rails and you live in a civilized society, just ignore what's going on in politics at the moment, but assume we've got a civilized society, you'd imagine, wouldn't you, that if you put your hand up for help, someone will pop along and help you get back on the rails. You'd imagine that, wouldn't you? Well, when you study people-centered services, that doesn't happen. You could have as many as a dozen people turn up, asking you questions, looking at you through their own specialist lens. Here's a control, specialisation. Trying to protect their budgets, another control. So they set thresholds. You've got to be bleeding to death before we help you. Of course, these people who don't get over the threshold, they get better, don't they? Really? So we turn people away. Or we can meet our activity targets for assessment, another control, by closing the case, you're not for us, and referring you on, which is why you get all these people turning up. And if somebody decides that you are for them and they will spend a bit of their budget, then in today's world, because the people in Whitehall think we need the market to drive costs down, the service that you get will be standardised. Because if you go to the market, you have to have a specification so they can price it. Now, what do you suppose happens when you provide a standardised service to a population of people where the demand has variety? So an awful lot of these services that we provide to people are ineffective. And the commissioners who buy these services assume that demand is the same as the number of services we did last year. Does that make sense? Oh, look, we put 100 people through drug treatment programs, so we better buy another 100 seats next year, because that's kind of the volume that we're doing. They've got no idea that the majority of those people didn't get help. You think about those controls. Right. All demand is work to be done. We worry about budgets, thresholds, specialisation, standardisation. Same, but it's profoundly awful, isn't it? So how do you think it works when you know? And the important thing is that if you're a leader of a care services organisation, you might find it difficult to believe that. And you've got to go and study it. One of the beauties is these are some of the easiest systems to study, because everyone makes records. And you get a real shock. Because you see that how many people got involved in talking to this person? How many people referred it on? What did they do? They met all their targets, but when you put it all up on the wall, it's massive. And then when you ask the question, when did we actually go and find out what happened to this person, what mattered to them? And the answer is no, we never did that. We addressed from our point of view, not from their point of view. So that's what you do. Turn it around. What's the first most important thing? Knowledge of demand, predictability of demand. You learn that demand isn't growing, as the politicians believe. Demand is stable. The volume of failure demand is extraordinary. And when you look at the predictability of what we call the value demands, stuff where people are that's entirely predictable. And it tells you the expertise you need. And the most important expertise you need is people who have the ability to go out and say, what happened to you? To see what context this occurred in. So you don't need to have a particular specialism. You need to have the skills to get out there, establish what happened, what's the context, what's going on around you. And when you're clear about that, help them establish what they would regard as a good life or a good result or a good death. And once that's clear, and it takes as long as it takes, once that's clear, what can you help them do to take responsibility in achieving that? And when that's clear, what resources can we pull from the family, from the community, from the voluntary sector, from the state sector, to help you in that end? And the consequence is everything that we provide is helpful. So, there are quite a lot of councils all around the world who are doing this. And what they learn is they provide far more effective services and the costs fall out. You see, the true narrative, the politicians tell you that demand is rising, people are getting older, who's going to pay? The true narrative is demand is stable, the services are ineffective, we waste about half the money on care services that we spend. So you can understand that, that's not an attractive narrative for a politician. They don't like to say they've got something wrong. But fortunately, local politicians are up for doing useful things in their communities. Do you know the most important problem we helped the Swedes solve was continuity? People, if you've got someone coming into your house to help you do, hygiene things or whatever it is, you like to have the same person, okay? But another part of the design is that the relationship should be thermostatic. In other words, I'm not coming for half an hour, I'm coming for as long as it takes. That will vary according to what I find when I get in there. It could be 10 minutes, could be 2 hours, whatever. So the Swedes have got the thermostatic bit working really well, and then what they wanted was, how do we provide continuity? And for us, that's a simple statistical exercise. I won't bore you with it, but that's the most important thing. And the Swedes tend to talk to each other, so there's a lot of people who understand how to do that in Sweden. So there we are, you see. People who run their organisation as a system, if it's a transactional service, control with understanding demand, are focused on just doing the value work and measuring achievement of purpose in customer terms. It's that easy. The hard part is this, changing this. That's why the leaders have to study, and when the extent to which the leaders get involved, study and lead it will determine how quickly the change occurs. But it will occur, and the leaders will cross a Rubicon and they will not come back. You cannot go back to command and control thinking when you've understood and employed a different logic. So, what we're doing today, that's kind of, that's what I made up. That's what we do. That's what we teach. We haven't been in Aviva for years because there's a whole bunch of people know exactly how to do this in Aviva. And so we will start today by going through an example of that in practice in a big, hairy, massive repair system with all of its, not a simple one, big ugly one. Just so you get a feel for that. But then we want to move on to the things that we've been doing in the last few years, which I think are quite exciting. Because after you've spent a lot of time redesigning service operations, you realise there's a lot of other parts of the system that need to change, because the things in what I would call the management factory actually exert controls. And rather than leave it to the operations managers to have that fight, we've been investigating and redesigning the way we think. In particular, the three that we're going to do today are finance, IT, and HR. Is there anybody here from HR? Great, I just need to know where you are. Because you're coming last today. Good. And so that's our plan. Peter Drucker, he said that as we move towards knowledge workers, the number of managers that we're going to need will be certainly fewer. And do you know what's amazing is it's gone the other way. There are more. Gary Hamel, the most expensive management consultant on the planet, has something he calls the bureaucracy mass index. This, in my language, is like the size of your management factory. So it's really important. I want to show you some of the work that we're doing to tackle that. Okay? And that will be your day. Thank you for your attention.